Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 16th Annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. My name is Hillel Neuer. I'm the Executive Director of United Nations Watch, one of the 25 human rights NGOs that is co-sponsoring the 2024 Geneva Summit. Now, in a month's time, the United Nations will open the 56th session of the Human Rights Council. We are here this morning and today to put a spotlight on urgent situations that require its attention, that require the attention of the international community. Now, we recently celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was adopted in 1948, right after the atrocities of the Nazi Holocaust and World War II, in response, as written in the preamble, quote, to barbarous acts which outraged the conscience of mankind. Its purpose was to reaffirm faith and fundamental human rights in the dignity and worth of the human person. 7 decades later, our task here today is to bring this promise into reality. We must stand with the courageous people you're about to hear from, because 7 decades after the Universal Declaration, it seems all too often the dictators, the abusers, are working very closely together, getting more and more shameless, from Havana to Harare, Nicaragua to North Korea, Moscow to Beijing. They're working together. Russia's Putin tomorrow is visiting Beijing. Beijing is backing the Islamic regime in Iran. The Islamic regime in Iran is arming Putin to kill people in Ukraine. Putin is behind Lukashenko in Belarus. North Korea backs Venezuela's Maduro regime. The dictatorships are working together. They empower each other's economies. They share surveillance technology to spy on their people. They share arms to kill their own people. We here in the free world, what is our response? Too often, it seems, we lack unity, purpose, and resolve. That has to end. Because the people that you'll hear from today, they really need our help. Dissidents, defenders of human rights, family members of current political prisoners, former political prisoners who are speaking out for those still languishing behind bars. They need our help. We say here in the West that we believe in women's rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. They are putting their lives on the line for our principles. How are we reacting? You know, this is a blank white paper. There's nothing written on it. If you stand up in Moscow or Beijing with nothing but a blank white paper, you will be immediately arrested and taken away. In China, in Shanghai, that was what Rui Xia did. She protested with a blank white paper. She was arrested and held in solitary confinement. The story of the white paper protest movement went around the world. Ray is with us today. We'll hear from her soon. Abduweli Ayub is a linguist and poet. In Xinjiang, he defended the Uyghur language and culture. He was arrested, brutally interrogated, imprisoned for 15 months. We'll hear soon from Abduweli. In Tibet, China regime is destroying the Tibetan culture, has trampled thousands of temples. Chimi Lamau is a brilliant activist for the Tibetan people. When Xi Jinping, the dictator, came to Paris, she and her friends made sure that wherever he went, he saw giant posters, including next to the Arc de Triomphe, for the Tibetan people, an example of what a committed activist can do. In Russia, Vladimir Putin is forcibly conscripting young men into his war against the innocent people of Ukraine. Journalist Alexandra Garmazhapova dared to speak out. She dared to defend ethnic minorities, to tell the truth about the Putin regime, to fight back. They sentenced her in absentia to 7 years in prison. She's here today continuing to speak out. And Putin threatens the entire region, not just his own people. He's seeking to wipe out an independent and free Ukraine off the map, but also to make war on the entire international rules-based system. Lisa Yasko is with us today. She's a member of the Ukrainian parliament, one of the most eloquent spokespersons for the cause, for the dignity of the Ukrainian people. We'll hear from her soon. In Zimbabwe, the regime, Robert Mugabe, died after decades of oppression. We thought there'd be a change, no change. The system remains, elections are fake. And one person who dared to speak out, Job Sikala, he exemplifies the courage to defy this regime. They threw him in prison for 2 years for his activism. He got out just recently. He's come here to be with us, flew thousands of miles, and we'll hear from him about the courage to defy the regime in Zimbabwe. In North Korea, one of the world's worst regimes on the planet, a police state if ever there was one, with concentration camps. Sadly, here in Geneva, North Korea is sitting on the executive board of the World Health Organization, even though it has the worst health system in the world. We're going to hear in a moment from Hyosim Mang. She speaks out for the plight of North Koreans, including the plight of disabled individuals in that country. In Vietnam, where the government has been cracking down against free speech and political activism, we'll hear from Chun Tin Nguyen, who was thrown into prison for more than 4 years as a prisoner of conscience because he dared to speak out for democracy. And then you go across the world in Cuba, another police state, sadly. Cuba as well is sitting across the street at the UN Human Rights Council as a member. There was an artist and musician, Carolina Barrero, who dared to speak out, an art historian. She was arrested, detained, forced into exile for her participation in peaceful protests. She remains one of the leading critics of the Cuban regime's repression. We'll hear from her soon today. In Venezuela, the Maduro regime caused 7-8 million people to flee the country, unheard of, and crushing any form of democracy and freedom. Victor Navarro, a journalist who dared to speak out for vulnerable groups in Venezuelan society for freedom. They threw him into prison, arbitrarily detained at the age of 22, abused physically, psychologically, tortured, while held in an infamous prison. And there's a virtual reality display outside where you can witness, get a glimpse of what he and his compatriots have had to suffer. He has the courage to be here today and to bear witness to what he experienced. In Bolivia, the regime that is the ally of Maduro under Evo Morales for many years, who was known as Baby Chavez, they tampered with the elections to stop opposition people from speaking out, like Toribia Lero Quispe, an indigenous leader. She's a member of the Legislative Assembly. They tried to tamper with her election. She continues to speak out despite facing violence, intimidation, and she's here with us today. In Nicaragua, the dictator Daniel Ortega didn't want to have any competition, so he arrested and threw into prison all of the other candidates a couple of years ago. And a young man in 2018 at a public event was given the microphone, and in front of the dictator, he called him out for his horrific crimes in front of the dictator. He was brutally punished. He was charged with conspiracy to undermine national integrity, sentenced to 13 years in prison. He managed to flee the country, and Lester Aleman will be speaking with us today. In the Gambia, the law that prohibits female genital mutilation, a horrific practice against young girls in that country and many other countries around the world. 230 million girls face female genital mutilation. The ban on that practice is under threat to be repealed. In the Gambia, they want to repeal that law to allow FGM. And one woman stands on the world stage, Fatou Balde, is fighting against the repeal of that law, which could happen next month. She's here with us today, and we need to stand with her. And she will be receiving our 2024 Women's Rights Award. And you know, as we meet here today, across the street, this week and the past few months, there is the UN Commission, the Conference on Disarmament, and the one holding the gavel as president is the Islamic regime in Iran, chair of the World Conference on Disarmament, the country that threatens the region and the world with war and terrorism, funding terrorist groups around the world. This regime is in charge of disarmament. And it's a regime that not only threatens its neighbors, but it crushes and kills, beats, blinds, and poisons and gases its own people. An innocent scholar from Australia, Kylie Moore Gilbert, was in Iran, was thrown into prison under false charges, imprisoned for 804 days as a practice known as hostage diplomacy, to leverage Western hostages to get things from Western countries. She eventually got out. She was released, went back to Australia, and could have lived her life in silence, as many people who experienced that would have done, but she has decided to dedicate her life to speaking out for those who are still behind bars under this regime. We're going to hear soon from Kylie Moore-Gilbert. And you know, one of the amazing media organizations that is dedicated to exposing the crimes of this regime is Iran International, only in existence for 7 years, manages to reach 20 million people, speaking out to defend those who marched on the streets just 2 years ago for the Women Life Freedom Movement. Thousands of people were arrested and crushed and injured. Their eyes were shot at. People were blinded for daring to march. Iran International is the leading group exposing that. They will receive our Moral Courage Award, and representing them will be the news director, Aliasgar Ramazanpour, convicted in absentia by Tehran's Revolutionary Court. His organization is under threat repeatedly. They're based in London, but repeatedly under threat, and they continue to speak out. And we're going to hear also from Pouria Zerati, journalist from Iran International, news presenter, who himself on March 29th was brutally attacked and stabbed by agents of the regime to threaten and silence him and his friends, and yet barely 2 months later, he's with us today to bear witness. Ladies and gentlemen, as we listen to the stories of these remarkable individuals, it is our responsibility to draw inspiration from their unyielding courage, from their unwavering commitment to justice and human rights. And in a moment, we're going to hear from the former Prime Minister of France, Mr. Manuel Valls, who's a leading voice on the international stage for democracy and speaks out with great conviction. We're honored. We're going to hear from him in just a moment. I'll remind everyone, please use your platforms on social media. Spread the word, amplify, hashtag Geneva Summit 2024. Geneva Summit 2024. The summit is not only a platform to hear from these brave souls, but it gives each of us the opportunity, as we heard on the video, to amplify their voices on a global stage so that we can pressure our governments and the international community to take action and stand with these heroes of human rights and democracy. Thank you very much.